Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving back into some entitled people stories. Today we've got 3 tales of people who insisted on strict rules and got exactly what they asked for. Here we go. New manager demanded strict 6 to 6. So we did. About 10 years ago, I was working FIFO, flying in and out to a remote site on an 8 days on, 6 days off roster. It was a solid setup. The shifts were long, 12 hours, 6 in the morning to 6 in the evening, but the extended time off made it worthwhile. You worked hard, you banked your money, and then you had nearly a week to actually live your life. For a while, everything ran smoothly, especially because our small crew had a rhythm that made those long days manageable. We carpooled from camp to site every day in a work vehicle, including the manager. Camp was about 5 kilometers away from the site, so we'd meet at the vehicle around 5:30 a.m. sharp. Truth be told, we were almost always at our desks and working by 5:40 a.m., sometimes even earlier. No one was clock watching. If you were there and ready, you just got started. At the end of the day, it was common practice to wrap up around 5:55 p.m., pile into the vehicle, and head back to camp. 5 minutes wasn't exactly daylight robbery, especially considering we'd been effectively starting early for years. Then we got a new manager. At first, things were reasonable. They seemed keen to learn how the team functioned and didn't make many changes. Over time, though, something shifted. The tone hardened. Policies were suddenly being quoted verbatim. One afternoon after we left at our usual 5:55 p.m., we were all called into the office the next morning. "We've noticed you're leaving before 6, the manager said, arms folded. "Your shift ends at 6. From now on, you stay until 6. We explained that we typically started early and often worked through breaks. Most of us eat at our desks, I pointed out. We're usually already working 20 minutes before 6. "That's not the point," they replied. "The official shift is 6 to 6. "Fine. If we're going to do this by the clock, we do it properly." The next morning, we all made a silent agreement. Instead of being at our desks by 5:40, we stayed at the vehicle until closer to 5:55 a.m. The manager was still sitting there at 5:30, waiting like usual. We didn't rush. If the rule was that time mattered, then every minute mattered. We began walking into the building at 5:55, clocking in at 6 and not a minute earlier. Lunch changed too. We'd always grabbed a quick bite at our desks and kept working, especially if something urgent popped up. Now at exactly midday, we got up and went to the lunchroom. Full break, no emails, no radio chatter, just a quick question. The first time someone interrupted, one of the guys calmly said, "We'll handle that after lunch," and kept eating. It was almost impressive how quickly the team adjusted. At the end of the day, we stopped wrapping up early. If work was done at 5:50, we tidied slowly. We double-checked things that didn't really need checking. We waited until the clock hit 6 before even thinking about walking out. Urgent tasks that had once been squeezed in during breaks or those early starts began carrying over. Things that could have been handled in 10 spare minutes now sat until the next morning. Didn't take long for productivity to dip in small but noticeable ways. Nothing catastrophic, just enough that deadlines felt tighter. Tasks that were once finished comfortably were now brushing up against the edge. After about 3 weeks of this, the manager's manager came down to site for a visit. He pulled a few of us aside. "Why are these reports running late?" he asked. "This wasn't happening before." We didn't exaggerate. We simply explained. "We were told not to start early and not to leave early," one of my coworkers said. "We're sticking to 6 to 6. Breaks are taken off the floor as required." He blinked at us. "You used to start early?" "Most days," I said, "and we'd often eat at our desks." There was a long pause. He nodded slowly, thanked us, and walked off toward the manager's office. The higher-up heard the same story you'd already told the manager, only this time someone was listening. The manager got to explain why productivity dropped after they cracked down on people who were doing extra work for free. That afternoon, just before knockoff, we were called in again. The tone was noticeably different this time. "As long as the work is completed," the manager said stiffly, "you may leave up to 5 minutes early." We exchanged glances, but kept our faces neutral. "Understood," I replied. The next morning, we were back in the vehicle at 5:30 a.m. By 5:40, we were working again. Lunch occasionally went back to desk eating when it made sense. Those small pockets of unofficial effort returned, and so did the smoother workflow. Funny how that happens when you treat people like adults instead of time cards. The manager lasted another 6 months after that. Whether they were pushed out or chose to leave, I never found out. What I do know is that the culture shifted back to what it had been before: mutual understanding. We weren't trying to cheat anyone out of 5 minutes. We were trying to make a demanding schedule function in the real world. It's amazing how quickly goodwill disappears when you nickel and dime it. 5 minutes can either be a gesture of trust or a battlefield, depending on how it's handled. In our case, it took 3 weeks of strict compliance for someone higher up to realize that sometimes flexibility isn't weakness, it's efficiency. After that, nobody mentioned the 5 minutes again, and we never forgot how quickly things can grind to a halt when someone decides that the clock matters more than the work. And our second story. I don't need a reason to use my PTO, but my boss demands one, so I've developed a very tragic extended family. I work in what most people would describe as an aggressively low-stress job. There are deadlines, sure, but nothing that involves life or death stakes or even mild corporate panic. The workload's steady, the expectations are clear, and the pay is decent enough to keep me from wandering off into the wilderness. In other words, it's the kind of job where taking your paid time off shouldn't require a dramatic justification worthy of a courtroom monologue. Unfortunately, my boss believes otherwise. A couple of years ago, he developed a strange fixation. He decided that whenever someone requested paid time off, they had to provide a good reason. Not just dates, not just a request, a reason. It had to be explained and then approved as though he were personally funding the vacation out of his own wallet. He'd say things like, "We just need to make sure time off is being used responsibly," which sounded ridiculous considering it was a benefit written into our contracts. At first, people tried to play along: family trip, wedding, medical appointment, basic non-invasive explanations, but he would sometimes press for details, tilting his head and asking, "What kind of appointment?" or "Is this something that can be scheduled after hours?" It became clear that he didn't just want a reason, he wanted to evaluate whether our reasons met his personal standard of importance. The irony is that the job itself is so calm that the most intense week we'd had in months involved reorganizing a shared drive. After one particularly busy stretch, busy by our standards, meaning we actually had to skip a coffee break, I decided I wanted 3 days off just to recharge. No trip planned, no family event, just me, my couch, and the noble pursuit of staring at the ceiling in silence. Then my boss sent out an email. Reminder, it read, that all PTO requests must include a clear reason and will be subject to approval based on necessity. Subject to approval based on necessity. As if exhaustion needed to present its credentials at the door? I sat there staring at the email, and something in me snapped, not in an angry way, but in a theatrical one. If he wanted a reason, I was going to give him a reason. Not a simple one, a cinematic one. I walked into his office later that afternoon, shoulders slightly slumped, face arranged into what I hoped was convincing emotional strain. He looked up from his monitor. "Hey," he said, "what's up?" "I wanted to talk about my time off request," I began, letting my voice soften. "It's about my dad." That got his attention immediately. He leaned back, concerned. "I haven't really talked about this at work," I continued, pausing for effect, "but my dad's been going through chemotherapy. It's been a lot. For the record, my father had been cancer-free for years. He was perfectly healthy and currently arguing with a neighbor about fence height back home. But at that moment, in that office, he was battling a dramatic and conveniently timed illness. I'm just so used to seeing him as this strong and vulnerable guy," I said, staring at the carpet as though it held my sorrow. "And now he's just human, you know? And you start thinking about how much time you have left. How do you even process that?" I didn't cry. I didn't need to. My theater elective from sophomore year carried me through the performance beautifully. My boss looked deeply uncomfortable. His confident managerial posture dissolved into awkward shifting. "Of course," he said quickly, "take whatever time you need." "Thank you," I whispered, as if this approval meant everything. I walked out of his office with my 3 days approved and a newfound strategy. He wanted a reason, you gave him one. A really good one. The kind that makes it impossible to say no without looking like a monster. That's not lying, that's giving the policy exactly what it asked for. You wouldn't think that such an encounter might inspire him to reconsider the policy, perhaps a follow-up email saying that personal time was, in fact, personal. But no, the policy remained. Reasons were still required, so I adapted. The next time I wanted a few days off, my grandmother had a serious fall. The time after that, she needed minor surgery. A year later, she unfortunately passed away. Then, astonishingly, she passed away again, and once more after that. The woman had the resilience of a soap opera character. Each time I delivered the news in person, each time he visibly wilted. "Another funeral?" he asked once, rubbing his forehead. "Yes," I replied solemnly. "It's been a difficult year for my family." He approved it immediately. To be clear, I'm not proud of the fictional death toll I've racked up, but I also refuse to justify using vacation days to sit in my apartment and eat cereal at 2 p.m. while watching bad television. Those days belong to me, and if I want to dedicate them to staring blankly at a wall and contemplating my life choices, that should be sufficient. The best part is how deeply uncomfortable he remains whenever I request time off in person. If I email him, he responds neutrally. But if I walk into his office and close the door behind me, his entire demeanor changes. You can see the panic flicker across his face as he braces for whatever tragedy is about to unfold. "Is everything okay?" he asked the last time I stepped in. I gave him a long, meaningful look before saying, "It's complicated." He approved the days before I even finished the sentence. At this point, I suspect he regrets ever insisting on explanations. He can't revoke the policy without admitting it was unnecessary in the first place, but he also dreads the emotional roller coaster I bring through his doorway. It's a stalemate built entirely on his need for control. All I ever wanted was to use my paid time off without narrating my personal life like a dramatic podcast. Instead, I've become the office's unofficial soap opera. My relatives have survived illnesses, accidents, and multiple funerals, all in service of me enjoying a quiet, long weekend. If he ever decides to scrap the good reason requirement, I'll happily retire my imaginary tragedies. Until then, I have an entire extended family of fictional crises ready to deploy. And honestly, if he insists on turning vacation requests into auditions, I'm more than willing to keep delivering award-worthy performances. And our last story. The man who terrorized our neighborhood over a pond just lost $8,500 and his HOA seat. Our neighborhood has a small retention pond tucked against a thin line of woods at the very back of the development. It's not something you'd see on a postcard, just a functional basin built 20 years ago when the houses went up. But it's always been full of bluegill and the occasional decent-sized bass, and for as long as anyone can remember, the neighborhood kids have fished there. It's the kind of simple tradition that doesn't need organizing, just a cane pole, a worm, and a free Saturday morning. Then Dale became HOA president. Dale had recently retired from something vague and government-sounding that he referenced constantly but never explained. He was a large man with a permanent scowl and the unsettling habit of standing just a little too close during conversations. Almost immediately, he started treating the neighborhood like his personal jurisdiction. He issued warnings about grass being a quarter-inch too tall, trash cans being visible from the street for an extra hour, and cars parked slightly off-center in driveways. But the pond became his fixation. "It's a liability," he declared at one HOA meeting, slapping the table for emphasis. "Kids fall in, parents sue, I'm shutting it down." The problem was that he couldn't. Fishing had never been prohibited. The pond was designated common area, and the bylaws clearly stated that common areas were for community use. But Dale wasn't overly concerned with details that contradicted his preferences. He began enforcing rules that didn't exist, relying more on intimidation than policy. He'd march down to the pond, arms crossed, glaring at children until they packed up and left. He took close-up photos of them, which understandably scared the younger kids. He called parents and warned them about fines that weren't written anywhere in the governing documents. Most families, not wanting the headache, simply told their kids to find something else to do. My son Leo kept fishing. Leo's 9, thoughtful and stubborn in that quiet way some kids are. He'd saved his allowance for months to buy a spinning rod and reel combo he'd fallen in love with at the outdoor store. It cost $70, which might as well have been $700 in his world. He added another $20 for a small tackle box and a handful of lures he researched obsessively. Every Saturday morning, that rod went over his shoulder and he headed to the pond like it was sacred ground. Dale had already confronted him twice. The first time he barked that fishing was illegal. Leo came home shaken but confused. "It's not in the rules, Dad," he told me. "He just says it is." I told him to stay calm, stay respectful, and keep fishing. I genuinely believe that if Dale didn't get a reaction, he'd eventually lose interest. I was wrong. It happened on a Saturday afternoon. I was reorganizing shelves in the garage when I heard yelling from the direction of the pond. Not the usual excited kid noise. This was loud, angry, adult yelling. I dropped the screwdriver I was holding and ran. By the time I reached the pond, the damage was done. Dale was standing there, red-faced and breathing heavily. Leo was several feet away, crying openly. 2 other boys stood frozen near the water, wide-eyed and silent. "You don't listen, do you?" Dale shouted. "I told you to stay away from here." In his hands were the broken halves of Leo's rod. He'd snapped it over his knee. The sound must have echoed. Even in the still air, I could almost hear it lingering. He tossed the pieces at Leo's feet like trash. "Next time I call the cops," Dale added before turning and walking off. Leo crumpled when I reached him. He was shaking, not just upset about the rod, but about being confronted so aggressively. "He grabbed it, Dad," he said between sobs. "I wasn't doing anything wrong." I believed him without question. The other boys confirmed it immediately. Dale had marched down, yanked the rod from Leo's hands, and broken it while shouting. That was the entire story. I walked Leo home and made sure he was safe with his mom. Then I sat down at my computer and started documenting everything. I photographed the broken rod from multiple angles. I wrote down a timeline while it was fresh. I called the parents of the other boys and asked if they'd be willing to give statements. They were furious and agreed immediately. Next, I called the police. A deputy came out, took the report, and spoke to the kids. He looked at the snapped rod and sighed. "This isn't just an HOA dispute," he said. "This is destruction of property. And if your son felt threatened, that's another layer." After that, I contacted a local attorney I trusted. He listened carefully, asked for the police report number, and said, "We'll pursue this against him personally. This isn't HOA business. This is an adult choosing to bully a child." Dale laughed when he was served papers. He told anyone who'd listen that I was suing over a toy. He posted on the neighborhood Facebook page about overprotective parents and kids who needed discipline. He seemed convinced that this would blow over. It didn't. During his deposition, under oath, Dale admitted he had grabbed the rod. He admitted he broke it intentionally. He admitted there was no written rule prohibiting fishing. When asked why he did it, he said someone needed to teach that kid respect. My attorney calmly replied he was fishing on common property. That's what you're referring to? The HOA board, realizing how exposed they were, distanced themselves quickly. They called an emergency meeting and voted to remove Dale as president. A formal apology was issued to the neighborhood, specifically acknowledging that children had the right to use the pond. The case never went to trial. The judge reviewed the deposition and the evidence and ruled directly. She awarded $1,000 in compensatory damages and $7,500 in punitive damages. She ordered Dale to complete 50 hours of community service and to submit a written apology to Leo for court approval. Dale thought he was teaching respect. The judge taught him that respect goes both ways. A written apology filed with the court saying he was wrong. Leo keeps it in his tackle box. That's the kind of lesson that actually sticks. He wrote the letter. It was stiff and clearly drafted with legal guidance, but it included the words, "I am sorry for breaking your fishing rod. It was wrong." Leo keeps it tucked into his new tackle box. Dale sold his house within the year. The new family that moved in has 2 boys who fish there every weekend without incident. Leo picked out a new rod himself, better than the old one, smoother, stronger, something he earned the hard way. The rest of the settlement money went into his college account. Dale tried to assert power over a pond. Instead, he ended up paying for the privilege of being wrong. And every Saturday when I see kids casting lines into that water, I'm reminded that sometimes the simplest traditions are worth defending. Let's talk about what each of these stories reveals about power and consequences. The FIFO crew had been starting early and working through breaks for years, not because they had to, but because it made the job smoother. The new manager saw only the clock, not the effort. When they demanded strict 6 to 6 compliance, they got it, along with the productivity drop that followed. The PTO boss wanted reasons because he believed time off needed to be justified. He didn't seem to understand that PTO belongs to the employee, not the company, so the employee gave him reasons. Dramatic, emotional, increasingly tragic reasons. The boss now panics whenever someone closes his office door. Dale wanted control over a pond. He wanted children to fear him. He wanted to prove that his authority extended beyond what was written. When a 9-year-old kept fishing, Dale broke his rod. He thought that would be the end of it. Instead, it was the beginning. Deposition testimony, police reports, a judge ordering him to pay $8,500 and write an apology to a child. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.